In the last few episodes, we talked about Gandalf and Saruman meeting in Isengard and how the place changed to create an army. We also learned about orcs. There's still more to say, but the Uruk-hai will appear later in the films again, where we will also return to this topic. In the meantime, Frodo and his friends are coming closer to Weathertop, which is called Amon Sûl in Sindarin, meaning potentially the same, even though it literally means hill of wind. There's the idiom wind and weather, and it seems likely that special meteorological conditions are connected to the names. The weather hills, Weathertop is the southernmost part of them, have it in their name too, but to my knowledge there is no known Sindarin name for them. Weathertop is described as having a conical top slightly flattened at the summit, and the east road passes it nearby. On Amon Sûl itself, we find a mysterious ruin and have some iconic scenes in the films and books there. But what is the story and the lore behind this place? Before we continue, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it. Shoutouts to Kimberly80 for letting me use her artwork, and of course, spoiler warning. In the book, Strider discussed going to Weathertop with the hobbits in the Midgewater marshes. He was not sure if they should go there and thought that it was dangerous, but also a chance to meet Gandalf. A concern was that birds and other animals spying for the enemy, but also the enemies themselves, could easily spot them from the hills because they would have a good overview of the whole area, including the east road, so getting close was a risk. However, Strider decided to carefully get closer from the other weather hills north of it and see if it's safe. If we look at the route, they leave the Midgewater marshes and climb the weather hills, which were around 1,000 feet or 300 meters high, to go down south to reach Weathertop from the north side. In the film it's shown quite different. Weathertop looks like a lonely hill and they seem to go there pretty straightforward instead of taking a detour over the other hills to be unseen as long as possible. On their way through the hills, we find an interesting detail in the book. Frodo says that he lost weight, and if he continues, he might become a wraith. Strider interrupts him, almost scolding him that he should not say such things when the enemy is near. I mentioned this in earlier episodes, that people usually don't even dare to say the names of the enemies from Mordor. It's also a slight foreshadowing of what will happen on Weathertop, in my opinion. They also reached an ancient man-made path, and it was protected relatively well by huge stones, so they could move along it without getting seen too much. They also saw the ruins on Weathertop now being much closer, and Merry asked about them and the path. Strider explained that the ruin was once a great watchtower of the Northern Kingdom and that men had to defend this place against the forces of the Witch King of Angmar in their latter days. We come to this in a moment. The tower is described as tall and fair, but I could not find any precise number mentioned by Tolkien on its height. Still, it's described that it gave you a good overview of the whole area. Also, the mentioned path was created to support the watchtower of Amon Sûl and the other defensive lines of the Dún-Edain on the weather hills. But let us dive into the lore of this place and connect it to Aragorn. Historically, Amon Sûl is a very special place, especially for Strider, and there is some depth in the lore to discover here which is lost in the films. In Middle-earth, there are several groups of men. In Rohan and surroundings, we have, for example, the Northmen. In Gondor, and back in the day Arnor, we have the Dún-Edain, the Westmen in exile, who once had the most powerful kingdom of men on an island called Númenor, which was probably inspired by the Atlantis myth of our world. After the destruction of Númenor, some Númenorians escaped with some artifacts and created two new kingdoms on Middle-earth. One was the South Kingdom, the mentioned Gondor, ruled by Isildur and his brother Anarion, and the other was the North Kingdom Arnor, ruled by Elendil, their father. Arnor, however, fell at some point in history, and all that was left of the line of kings are the chieftains of the Dún-Edain ranges. In the story of the Lord of the Rings, the current Dún-Edain chieftain is no other than Aragorn, as explained in earlier episodes. If we look at the map, it becomes clear that at this point in the film and book, we are still in a region that was once part of the kingdom of Arnor. With this, Amon Sûl was of course also once part of it. It was a watchtower that existed since the early days of the North Kingdom, so it was built at the end of the Second Age. Strider says in The Lord of the Rings, but long before, in the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sûl they called it. This implies it was built during Elendil's rule, who was the first king of Arnor in the Second Age, and who died in the final battle of the Last Alliance. We find more evidence for this in the scene where Strider explains the lore of it to the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings book. He mentions that it is told that Elendil once waited there for Gil-galad and his army coming from the west so their armies could march together to Gondor and then attack Mordor as the last alliance of elves and men to defeat Sauron and bring peace to Middle-earth. So this place was, you could say, the starting point of what led to Sauron's defeat and him losing the One Ring at the end of the Second Age. In this context, Amon Sûl has a very special meaning in the world. I also mentioned that the survivors of Numenor's destruction, including Elendil and his two sons Isildur and Anarion, once brought artifacts with them. The White Tree of Gondor and 7 Palantiri. Each Palantir was placed at a special tower. For example, in Isengard, in Minas Tirith, in Minas Ithil, now called Minas Morgul, in Osgiliath, and so on. And also one was in Amon Sûl. According to the unfinished tales, it was not any of the 7 seeing stones, but the most powerful of the stones of Arnor, so it was the equivalent of the Gondorian Palantir in Osgiliath. Both the Amon Sûl and the Osgiliath stone could not be lifted by one man, so they must have been quite big and heavy. All the Palantiri stood on low round tables of black marble, so somewhat similar to what we see in the films in Isengard. The Amon Sûl stone was also mainly used to communicate with Gondor. With this you can imagine that Weathertop was quite important for Arnor and Gondor too, because it was a connection between both kingdoms, which were relatively far away from each other. The next mention of Weathertop after its creation was centuries later and at a very dramatic point in the history of Arnor. After the death of King Eärnur, 3rd Age 861, there was a dissension between his 3 sons. The 2 younger sons disliked the idea of their oldest brother becoming the king, which ultimately led to them splitting Arnor into 3 kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan and Hrudauer. We heard this story in parts before. In this context, Weathertop's position was very special because it was exactly at the point where the borders of all 3 kingdoms met, and as you can imagine, a very disputed place. All wanted to possess its seeing stone. While Amon Sûl was once the starting point of Sauron's downfall, it was now in the middle of what started the downfall of Arnor. I think this detail is often lost, but it has so much thought behind it, it makes Weathertop almost a fateful place. Over time, the lines of the Dún-Edain kings weakened in Cardolan and especially Hrudauer, but also the kingdoms themselves were weakened. This was different in Arthedain though, and they could claim Amon Sûl. Their relation with Cardolan also became better, but all was still nothing compared to the former strength of Arnor. This weakness in the north did not went by unnoticed. The leader of the Nazgûl, the Witch-King, came into the north and founded the realm of Angmar, north of the Ettenmoors, close to the Grey Mountains. He allied with, I assume, old foes of the Númenóreans, who were probably once driven away to the natural borders of this region and hilllands by the expanding Númenóreans, who started to settle in this region too over the course of the Second Age. Considering this, they had reason to dislike the Dún-Edain. These people were called hillmen, and the Dún landings could be related to them. The Witch King of Angmar also gathered orcs and other fell creatures, which I assume came from parts of the Misty Mountains and the Grey Mountains, for example Gundabad, which should have been under his control during this time. He and his forces also built his chief fortress and capital, Carn Dûm. The meaning and origin of this name is not clear and debated. From Elvish to Dwarvish, it could be anything. All this was an ideal situation for the Witch King. He could easily get his foot into the door and started pressuring the three kingdoms of men. The hillmen got more and more influence in Hrúdawr until one became lord over it, ending the line of Dún-Edain kings there, and he also secretly allied with Angmar. Now the struggling kingdom of Cardolan and also Arthedain had a problem. As a reaction to the increasing threat, Arthedain under King Argileb I fortified Amon Sûl and the Weather Hills with the help of Cardolan and even the elves of Lindon. This is what Strider mentions when he explains the origin of Weathertop and the ancient paths through the Weather Hills they were using to the hobbits. And indeed, the two kingdoms managed to defend against Angmar together, but Argileb I was slain in battle, 3rd Age 1356. There is a small side note in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings that at this time Rivendell was besieged too. I assume Tolkien mentions this to explain why Rivendell was not helping and probably slightly referencing the situation in The Lord of the Rings, where the Nazgûl chase Frodo close to Rivendell too. However, the Westmen managed to hold the Weather Hills for 53 years until suddenly a huge host came from Angmar and surrounded them completely. Many Dún-Edain, including King Arvelec I, son of Argileb I, were slain, and the watchtower of Amon Sûl was burned down by the enemy and completely destroyed, becoming a ruin. However, its Palantir could be saved by the surviving Dún-Edain and was brought to Arthedain's capital Fornost. Angmar did not stop here and attacked Fornost too, but they could defend themselves. Cardolan was also attacked, and the few surviving Dún-Edain hid in the Barrow Downs or the areas around it. This also connects this story to the Barrow Downs, which are the graves of the kings and lords of Cardolan. And over time, with the war, the spreading of the Great Plague, and the Witch King summoning the Barrow Wights to the Downs, Cardolan was no more. Now it makes sense why those treasures, swords, shields and daggers were in the Downs too, and why those weapons were made to be effective against the Nazgûl. The Witch King was the main antagonist in the Angmar War. Help came from the elves. It seems Elrond managed to bring help from Lórien, and together with Lindon they could push back Angmar for some time, but the war with Angmar should continue for centuries. These events also had influence on the residents of this area who fled from the war, including the Stur-hobbits. And this is, in my opinion, a really fascinating detail. Some of the Sturs returned to the east, and guess where they settled? Around the Gladden Fields. Tolkien hints at this in Appendix A with the words, "and becoming a riverside people of fishers." In a way, the Witch King's war made two Stur-hobbits find the One Ring about 1,000 years later. This is a mind-blowing little detail and quite the irony. Sadly, here the story of Amon Sûl ends. Arthedain, as last surviving kingdom, fell 500 years after the Watchtower's destruction too, and so Arnor was destroyed, even though the line of kings survived, but there was nothing to rule anymore, and they became the chieftains of the Dún-Edain Rangers. Gondor was too late with their help. They arrived when Arthedain was no more, but could at least finally defeat Angmar with the help of the elves, cleansing the land from Angmar's forces. But the Witch King escaped and continued by bringing war over Gondor. It was also here where the powerful elf Glorfindel made the prophecy about the Witch King. The Gondorian prince and later King Eärnur wanted to chase the Witch King, but Glorfindel warned him with the words, "Do not pursue him, he will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of men will he fall." This will play a role much later again, but fits quite well into this section, so keep it in mind for when we reach episode 80 or something around that number. In all this time after the fall of Arnor, Amon Sûl remained a ruin, and its story was forgotten by most. Strider, as the current chieftain of the Dún Edain and descendant of the line of kings of Arnor and Arthedain, of course knew the story well. And maybe in knowing this, his decision to go there with the hobbits was influenced because Amon Sûl, the Hill of Wind, should become a place of fate again, a place where the wind can change. It was here where something powerful from Aman, the Palantir, connected Arnor and Gondor and stood against the enemy. In The Lord of the Rings, we find this again in the form of Gandalf, who is from Aman too. If I would overanalyze it, we could also say that the hell probably called with the Palantir was late, like Gandalf and his letter were late too. It was also here where the enemy almost won and got back the One Ring, but it was also here where a Dúnedain king defended Weathertop, his watchtower, against the Witch King and the other Nazgûl. Without him and Gandalf, Mordor would have won. And so here we have another turning point and the start of the fall of Sauron. Here again, Amon Sûl establishes a connection to Gondor through Aragorn, who will become the king of Gondor. Like Elendil and Gil-galad, he will march to Gondor's aid from here, not with an army, but a small fellowship, and with the shards of Narsil, Elendil's sword, that will be reforged to Andúril, the flame of the west in Rivendell soon, to bring the wind of change to Middle-earth. Thank you for watching. Now we have all the background information to understand Weathertop and its meaning, but also how iconic it is that Aragorn is the one who defends it against the Nazgûl. History repeating itself. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, feel free to press the like button, leave a comment, recommend me further, and maybe watch my other lore videos. In case you just stumbled upon this video, this is a video series and the playlist for it is in the description. Also, in case you want to subscribe, consider pressing the annoying bell. In addition, you can also follow me on Twitter too, or join my Discord server. Once or twice a week, I also stream games on Twitch TV. We just finished Jedi Fallen Order and had a look at Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Next will be some game-related videos. If possible, I try to make 2 videos, Games of the Decade and my favorite games of 2019. As always, with a more analytical approach. 2019 was an insane year when it comes to games. Of course, I will also continue with Lord of the Rings lore videos, but in December, time management is always tough for me. So maybe my next lore video will come next year, but it all depends on what video I finish first. I work on them in parallel. There are also some other interesting videos I plan for next year, and I wish you all a happy and peaceful holiday season. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.